10. Patricia Target. Roughly 4 miles north of Boca Grande Key, there's a shipwreck sitting in shallow waters measuring 5 to 15 feet deep. It looked a lot better decades ago when the hull was more intact and there weren't a handful of mangrove trees growing on the ship. But the trees were destroyed in a hurricane, and the wreck has been reduced to little more than a rusting heap of metal. It's rumored to be the remains of Henry Ford's private yacht, the Cialia, which also went by the names the Patricia Target ship and the Old Patricia Target. The vessel was originally called the USS Coral. The 214-foot yacht was built in 1914. Henry Ford bought it during the 1930s, and it was reacquired by the Navy in 1940 for service in World War II. During the war, the ship performed several naval cruises out of Philadelphia before relocating to Newport, Rhode Island, and then to Guantanamo Bay in Cuba, where it was used in training exercises. It found its final home in the Florida Keys, where military pilots used it for target practice after the war. 9. Henrietta Marie. The Henrietta Marie was a French-built slave ship that transported African captives to the West Indies. At some point during the late 17th century, the vessel fell into English hands, possibly as a war prize. It made at least 2 voyages as part of the Atlantic slave trade starting in 1697, when it carried hundreds of people to Barbados to be sold as slaves. In 1699, the Henrietta Marie dropped 191 captives off in Jamaica and took on a cargo of sugar, cotton, dyewoods, and ginger to take back to England. To avoid pirates who were known to lurk between eastern Cuba and modern-day Haiti, the captain sailed the ship around the western side of Cuba. The vessel ran aground on a reef roughly 35 miles west of Key West near the Marquesas Keys. There were no survivors, and for nearly 3 centuries, the Henrietta Marie's fate remained a mystery. A diver discovered the wreck in 1972 and found shackles and other items indicating that it was a slave ship. During excavations in the 1980s, marine archaeologists found a bell bearing an inscription of the ship's name, along with the year 1699, confirming its identity as the Henrietta Marie. They also found 2 large cauldrons, which were most likely used to prepare separate meals for the crew and the slaves. In 1993, the National Association of Black Scuba Divers placed a memorial plaque at the wreck site, dedicated to the captives who were forced into the brutal slave trade. 8. USS Wilkes Bar. The 610-foot USS Wilkes Bar was a medium-sized naval warship known as a light cruiser. It was built during World War II and served during the final year of the conflict. In January 1945, the ship participated in the South China Sea Raid as part of the Allied efforts to liberate Philippine island of Luzon from Japanese control. The Wilkes Bar also served in the Battle of Iwo Jima and Okinawa. For a brief period after the war, the vessel was used in training exercises in Guantanamo Bay. In 1947, she embarked on a goodwill cruise to Britain and Norway. Upon returning to the United States, the Wilkes Bar was decommissioned and placed on reserve in Philadelphia, where she remained until she was struck from the Naval Register in 1971. From there, the ship was taken to the waters off Florida and used in underwater weapons tests. During one of these tests off Key West in 1972, the cruiser broke in half. The stern portion sank on its own, and the military scuttled the bow section the next day. Since then, the wreck has become an artificial reef and a habitat for marine life. It sits upright at a depth of 320 feet and is a popular destination among experienced scuba divers. 7. USS Amesbury. Built in Massachusetts during World War II, the U.S. naval destroyer escort USS Amesbury served in the historic Allied invasion of Normandy, also known as D-Day, in 1944. She was eventually rewarded with the Battle Star for her service in the battle. In 1945, the ship was converted into a high-speed transport for carrying the men of an amphibious unit called the Underwater Demolition Team. After making landings in Japan, Korea, China, and Guam, the Amesbury proceeded to Green Cove Springs, Florida, where she was decommissioned and placed in reserve. The ship never served again. It was removed from the Naval Register in 1960, and in 1962 it was sold to a marine salvager named Chet Alexander. He made plans to sink the Amesbury in a deep part of the Gulf of Mexico as an artificial reef, but it ran aground while being towed to its final destination. There wasn't enough time to refloat the ship before a passing storm came through, and the inclement weather broke it in half. The two sections came to rest in about 25 feet of water and sit about 200 yards apart from each other. Its gun mount and anti-aircraft guns are located about 50 feet away from the vessel's port side. Today, the Amesbury is an artificial reef and diving site known as Alexander's Wreck. Have you ever visited an artificial reef? Tell us about it in the comments below and hit that subscribe button while you're at it. 6. SS City of Washington. Built in Pennsylvania during the 1870s by the American shipbuilding giant John Roach and Sons, the SS City of Washington was an iron-hulled merchant steamer that transported passengers and cargo between New York, Mexico, and Cuba. She was moored in Havana Harbor on the night of February 15, 1989, when the USS Maine exploded, marking the beginning of the Spanish-American War. The Maine was being kept in Havana to protect American interests amid deteriorating relationships with Spain when it was rocked by the blast. Although the city of Washington sustained minor damage, she was able to help rescue Maine survivors by providing lifeboats and allowing the use of her dining room as a makeshift hospital. For several months during the war, she served as a troop ship. The ship resumed its normal duties transporting passengers and cargo for the next 10 years, until being taken out of service and laid up in Brooklyn in 1908. 3 years later, the city of Washington was transported into a coal-transporting barge. Her career finally came to an end in 1917, when she ran aground on a shallow reef off Key Largo along with another barge and a tugboat. The other two vessels were raised, but the city of Washington had broken in two and was unsalvageable. It sank and has since become one of the most popular diving sites in the Florida Keys. 5. USCG Dwayne. After being built in Philadelphia during the 1930s, the U.S. Coast Guard cutter Dwayne began her career as a search and rescue and law enforcement vessel based out of Oakland, Florida. Just a few months later, in 1936, she was sent to Honolulu to participate in the American colonization of the Line Islands, which are located south of Hawaii in the Central Pacific. For 2 years, starting in early 1937, the Dwayne was part of the Bering Sea Patrol Force. Her next assignment began in 1939 off the coast of Newfoundland, Canada, where she conducted 4 neutrality patrols. As the US inched closer to entering World War II after years of adhering to an isolationist policy, the Dwayne was requisitioned by the Navy as WPG-33. From 1942 to 1943, she served as a convoy escort. In August of 1944, the ship participated in the Allied invasion of southern France known as Operation Dragoon. She remained in the Mediterranean for the next year, then returned to the US. The Dwayne spent the next 20 years rotating between weather stations off Newfoundland and Labrador as part of an international ocean weather station program. While the work most likely wasn't very exciting, it contributed significantly to the growth and safety of commercial overwater flights in the region. By the early 1970s, the weather patrols had essentially become obsolete to more advanced technology. The Dwayne was tasked with patrolling off the US coast in accordance with the recent implementation of stricter fishing laws and a notable increase in narcotics smuggling. She was decommissioned in 1985 as the oldest active US military vessel. 2 years later, the ship was sunk off Key Largo as an artificial reef, and in 2002 it was added to the National Register of Historic Places. 4. San Pedro. During the summer of 1733, the Dutch-built merchant ship San Pedro departed from Havana along with 20 other ships as part of a treasure fleet bound for Spain. The next day, a sudden change of winds indicated an oncoming hurricane, and the captain ordered the fleet to turn back. But it was too late to avoid the storm's path, and all but one of the fleet ships were destroyed, including the San Pedro. Several of the wrecks were refloated and taken back to Cuba, but the San Pedro was beyond saving. It was rediscovered in the 1960s by treasure hunters, who found thousands of silver Mexican pesos that went down with the ship and other artifacts. The wreck was quickly stripped of anything valuable. Over the centuries, the San Pedro became partially buried in sediment. Most of its exposed portions fell victim to shipworms or broke off and drifted away. What's left of the ship functions as one of Florida's oldest artificial reefs and is a designated archaeological preserve. 3. Adelaide Baker. Originally called the F.W. Carver, the bark that eventually became to be known as the Adelaide Baker was built in 1863 in Bangor, Maine. The 153-foot-long vessel was renamed when she was sold to the British, and she continued to work along the American coast. At the time, the US was experiencing a golden age of maritime shipping. While en route to Savannah, Georgia, on the night of January 28, 1889, with a cargo of timber, the Adelaide Baker ran aground on Coffin's Patch Reef off Key Colony Beach. Nearby vessels helped the captain and crew to safety, and everyone survived. The wreck's remains are spread over a 1,400-foot area roughly 4 miles southeast of Dunk Key, with a pile of spilled ballast marking the location where it hit the reef. It's evident that early salvors, known as wreckers in and around the Keys, placed parts of the ship in the water after salvaging what they could from it. The most recognizable piece of the scattered wreck is its 77-foot iron main mast. What's left of the Adelaide Baker has become overgrown with sponges, corals, and gorgonians. It sits in just 20 feet of water, making it a popular attraction among divers of all skill levels. 2. The Eagle. The Dutch-built freighter that eventually became the Eagle started her career as the Ryladan in 1962. She changed hands at least 6 times over the next 23, and went by numerous names including Baroque, Carmela, Itai, Etai, Karagolf Pioneer, Aaron K, and finally the Eagle Tire Co. While sailing from Miami to Venezuela as the Aaron K in 1985, the vessel caught fire. 2 Coast Guard cutters responded to the distress call, but the ship was destroyed past the point of being worth the cost of saving and was declared a total loss. The ship received her final name later that year, when she was purchased by the Florida Keys Artificial Reef Association with plans to sink her as an artificial reef. Things moved forward sooner than planned when the Eagle's moorings failed, causing her to sink 6 miles off the coast of Lower Matecumbe Key in 110 feet of water. Luckily, the vessel had been cleaned and gutted, and its oil and fuel had been removed, sparing the environment from pollution. In 1998, Hurricane Georges ripped the wreck into 2 pieces, which sit roughly 100 feet apart from each other today. 1. SS Benwood. Built in Liverpool, England during the early 20th century, the steam cargo ship SS Benwood entered service in 1910. Over the next 32 years, she passed through several owners and had various names, before ultimately operating as a Norwegian merchant freighter called the SS Benwood. During a routine voyage from Tampa, Florida to Norfolk, Virginia with a cargo of phosphate rock on April 9, 1942, the 360-foot-long vessel was blacked out due to the threat of a German U-boat attack. The nearby Robert C. Tuttle was also blacked out. Both ships were navigating based on their distance from Florida's coastal lines. But the method wasn't foolproof, and the Robert C. Tuttle's crew spotted a large black object in its path just before 1 o'clock in the morning. The captain signaled his intentions to turn to starboard using his whistle, but received no response. A few minutes later, the Benwood's crew spotted a large black object in the ship's path and signaled their intentions to turn to port, but also received no response. The vessels collided, and the Benwood began rapidly taking on water, forcing the crew to abandon ship. She came to rest off Key Largo in waters ranging from 25 to 45 feet deep. After sustaining significant damage from salvors, the wreck was declared a protected site and has since become popular among divers.
8. Base W. In 1956, the British Antarctic Survey built a remote research base on Detail Island, located off the coast of Antarctica's Arrowsmith Peninsula, known as Base W. The small outpost consists of just one long building and a pair of smaller outer structures. Scientists originally planned to travel from Base W to the Antarctic mainland by dog sled to conduct meteorology and geology research. However, their efforts were complicated by the ice surrounding the island, which was dangerous and unstable. In 1958, the annual freeze prevented the team's supply vessel from reaching them, even after ice-breaking ships tried to help them. Left with no other choice than to abandon the base, the researchers packed their most important belongings and walked 25 miles to an awaiting ship on the mainland that would take them back to Europe. Base W remained untouched for more than 3 decades. When members of the British Antarctic Survey visited during the 90s, they found that the team who evacuated had taken the time to properly winterize the site despite the urgency of their departure. The main building was filled with scientific equipment, clothing, books, food, everyday items, furniture, and other things that were forgotten about for more than 60 years. The visitors left the door to the base unlocked, and anyone who manages to reach the snow-covered island is free to go inside and look around. 7. HMS Arabis and HMS Terror. European explorers began searching for an Arctic route linking the Atlantic and Pacific Oceans during the 17th century. Nearly 150 years later, they still hadn't found the so-called Northwest Passage. In 1845, British Royal Navy officer and explorer Sir John Franklin set sail in search of the polar route with 134 crew members aboard 2 ships, the HMS Arabis and the HMS Terror. 2 months into the voyage, the vessels became trapped by floating ice in what would eventually become known as the Victoria Strait in northern Canada. The crew stayed on the ships for a year before they decided to head inland on foot. They brought with them enough food for 3 years, and their reasons for deserting the Arabis and Terror remain a mystery to this day. Because the expedition wasn't expected to arrive back in England for a while, nobody realized that something had gone wrong until the crew failed to return. More than 100 search missions were carried out over the following decade, but they found no traces of the ships or their crew members. Clues began to slowly turn up in various places, revealing that the crew members had died in several different locations and at different times. Human remains, handwritten notes, personal belongings, and eyewitness reports from local indigenous residents helped to put together the pieces of what happened to the ill-fated expedition. It was clear that the men tried to survive long enough to reach safety while battling malnutrition, disease, and exposure, but their bodies eventually gave out and couldn't handle any more suffering. The Arabis and Terror were finally located in 2014 and 2016 in the frigid waters off King William Island. In 2019, marine archaeologists explored the Terror with a remotely operated camera and were shocked to discover that it's surprisingly intact. Plates and glasses still line the shelves of the ship. There's beds, desks, and other furniture still in their designated places, and scientific instruments have remained in their cases. The team hopes to revisit the wreck and find diaries, records, and other evidence that might be able to help them better understand why the crew abandoned the ship. 6. Edinburg Manor. During the mid-1800s, Iowa government officials in Jones County used some federal grant money they'd received to build a country poor farm in the city of Monticello. It was originally described as a comfortable retreat for the lazy, able-bodied, and willingly dependent applicants, and was designed as a place where the poor and jobless could work in exchange for food and shelter. In reality, the country poor farm became a catch-all for struggling people of many different circumstances, including disabled individuals who had no other way to support themselves. The mentally ill and those who lacked the treatment and supportive services they needed were also drawn here. Unfortunately, it wasn't a safe place for vulnerable men and women like its builders had envisioned, and it was completely overrun with violence. More than 150 people died between 1850 and 1910 when the facility was demolished. It was replaced by a 12,000 square foot building called Edinburg Manor, which housed impoverished, elderly, disabled, and incurably insane individuals who lacked a support system in the real world. Over time, poorhouses across America were gradually shut down in favor of other social programs and resources. By the early 2000s, there were only a few dozen residents still living at the manor. It was abandoned entirely in 2011 when a private company bought the property with plans to turn it into a bed and breakfast. Structural safety concerns stopped that from happening, and Edinburg Manor remains empty to this day. It's currently owned by a couple who are dedicated to preserving its history, but these days, the building is known for being one of the most haunted places in America. It's still filled with medical equipment, paperwork, furniture, a piano, and personal belongings that were left behind by former residents. There's also a pauper cemetery outside containing a handful of headstones, marking the final resting places of some of the forgotten souls that once inhabited the manor. 5. A Forgotten Home. Parisian socialite Martha de Floria lived from 1864 to 1939. As an adult, she became known for her numerous love affairs with famous men including French Prime Minister Georges Clemenceau, former President Paul Deschanel, and Italian artist Giovanni Boldini. When de Florian died, Her oldest son, Henri Bergeron, inherited her apartment in Paris. However, when he also passed away in 1966, the apartment was simply locked up and left behind. The home was then handed to Henri's daughter and to Florian's granddaughter, Solange Bergeron. She had fled Paris during World War II and resettled in southern France with no plans to return, but she continued to pay the rent and expenses on the apartment. It wasn't until Solange's death in 2010 that the rest of the family realized the apartment was still being paid for, even though nobody had stepped foot inside it for more than 40 years. Her living relatives visited and found it to be just as it had been decades earlier. The apartment contained a vast array of items telling the story of de Florian's life, including a painting by one of the socialite's lovers, Giovanni Boldini. The artwork, which is thought to be a portrait of de Florian at the age of 24, sold for $3.4 million. The home was filled with numerous other paintings, as well as an old Mickey Mouse stuffed animal, a taxidermied ostrich, photographs, furniture, and much more. All of the remaining items were auctioned off to the public, but the breathtaking time capsule that Solange Bergeron's descendants found after her death continues to live on in photographs. Would you rather stumble upon a military base that was abandoned in the forest, or a long-forgotten cabin in the woods that was designed by a famous architect? Let us know in the comments below. And while you're at it, hit that subscribe button. 4. Evergreen Crystal Palace. Robert Plaster was an entrepreneur from Missouri who founded the energy supplier called Empire Gas and numerous other enterprises. He was incredibly successful, and during the 1990s, he used some of his wealth to build a 30,000 square foot mansion on a large hill that overlooks Table Rock Lake in Branson. The amazing 14-bedroom home, known as the Evergreen Crystal Palace, was the most expensive house ever built in Missouri at the time. It has a 20-car garage, a helipad, a shooting range, several kitchens, living quarters for domestic staff, and other luxurious amenities that most people can only ever dream of having. The property remained in the family after Plaster passed away in 2008, but nobody has lived there since then. The high-end decor, furniture, and appliances are visibly dated and out of style, but they're still in spectacular condition. Everything looks brand new, making a walk through the mansion feel like a literal step back in time. In 2021, the family decided to sell the house and listed it for $80 million. Real estate agent Ken Coleman came out of retirement to sell the mansion and invited YouTuber and urban explorer Big Banks to the property in hopes of attracting potential buyers. As a self-made multimillionaire from a modest upbringing, Plaster knew how much hard work it takes for the average person to succeed. He made it a priority to give back to the community, and in keeping with his wishes, proceeds made from selling the mansion will fund college scholarships. 3. Renowned architect's retro pad. Architect Bruce Goff became famous for his eccentric and sometimes flamboyant style during the mid-20th century. He even earned the respect of Frank Lloyd Wright, who was known to be very critical of American architects. In 2022, one of 3 homes in Kansas City that Goff designed went up for sale for the first time since they were sold shortly after being built in 1967, known as the Searing House. Its most recent owners had left it practically unchanged since the day they first purchased it. The octagonal one-bedroom residence has a large living room with a triangular fireplace. The home's kitchen is off to one side of this open central space, and so is the bedroom and 2 bathrooms. Inspired by Japanese minimalism and the concept of communal living, the rooms are only separated by wooden dividing walls that fold. The couple who owned the house for 55 years and raised a family in it took special care to preserve it. They remodeled the bathrooms at some point, but left the rest of the home almost exactly as it looked when they first bought it. The home is still complete with a vintage yellow countertop, wood paneling in the kitchen, and retro sofas, tables, chairs, and other furniture. The Searing House also has a deck and an unfinished lower level. The residence is currently listed on the Bash & Company Sotheby's International Realty website with an asking price of $975,000. 2. Shuttered Nightclub. During the 1980s, a British band called By Appointment performed many shows at a popular nightclub in Swansea, Wales called the Cavalier Bar. When the venue stopped booking them in 1988, they were scoring plenty of gigs elsewhere, so they didn't bother looking into why the bar was no longer hiring them. They eventually heard that the nightclub had closed down, possibly due to a licensing issue. Like most other businesses that fail, the Cavalier was soon forgotten about. It wasn't until 2022 when it was rediscovered by some workers who were tasked with turning the building into a community center. Two of the band's former members, bassist Craig Louis Lewis and drummer Nigel Muggs Morgan, dropped by the bar and found it practically unchanged since they last saw it. They immediately recognized the brick-lined ceiling's palm tree-like design and cavernous walls. The disused bar, which is located on the second floor above an old home goods store, looked as if everyone inside had abruptly left one day with little to no warning. It was filled with partially full beer cans and liquor bottles, along with cigarette packs. A handwritten menu offering cheap bar meals was still taped to the countertop near a Christmas decoration. A jar of cherries, some beer mats, and a horse racing bet sheet. In a BBC interview, Muggs remembered the Cavalier as a rough place that attracted a seedy crowd, but he and Louis reflected on their past performances with fondness, and being able to see the venue before it underwent renovations was an especially emotional experience for former drummer Louis, who suffers from memory issues due to MS. As soon as he walked in, he remembered songs the band used to play that he had struggled to recall for years. News of the discovery also caused a buzz throughout the community, bringing back long-forgotten memories of their younger and crazier days. But the reasons behind the Cavalier's sudden closure remain a mystery to this day. 1. Vintage Burger King. In 2022, a man named Jonathan Pruitt shared a photo of a remarkably intact Burger King restaurant that looked like it had sat frozen in time since the 1980s or 90s. He discovered the vintage fast food joint at the Concord Mall in Wilmington, Delaware, where it remains hidden behind a wall and is only accessible to mall employees. The restaurant opened in 1987 and closed its doors in 2009, but it looks as though it was never updated during its years of operation. Its teal and mauve wood-trimmed booths, counters, and garbage cans, as well as its white metal chairs, were perfectly preserved. By looking at the photo, it's hard to believe that the Burger King operated for more than 20 years without showing more signs of wear and tear. A Burger King spokesperson confirmed that the decor aligns with the company's restaurants that operated during the 80s and 90s. After Pruitt's photo went viral, a Twitter user shared a video she took of the restaurant in 2019 when it was being used as a storage room for her old job. Newcastle County Executive Matt Meyer and mall manager Tom Dalkey gave social media users an even closer look at the Burger King in a Facebook Live video. Dalkey said that it would be great to see the space reopened, but that the mall hadn't received any serious offers to buy it.
7. Explosive discovery. In July of 2022, a 1,000-pound bomb was discovered by fishermen along the banks of the River Po in Italy. The country had recently experienced its worst drought in 70 years, and huge sections of the 400-mile river had dried up, exposing what was underneath. According to Italian military officials, the bomb contained 530 pounds of explosives, and it was found near the village of Borgo Virgilio. After stumbling across the unexploded device, around 3,000 residents had to be evacuated from the area so that bomb disposal experts could detonate it safely. River traffic and the airspace above the site also had to be shut down so they could go ahead with the controlled explosion. The River Po is Italy's longest flowing river, stretching from the southwestern Alps all the way down to the Adriatic Sea. However, recent satellite images from 2022 have revealed that patches of dried riverbed are expanding along the river, no doubt as a result of the extreme drought the country's been facing. After making this discovery, a state of emergency was declared for the areas surrounding the river by Italian officials. The Po reportedly irrigates about 1/3 of Italy's agricultural production, but its current has now grown so weak that salty seawater has begun to seep into the river, which has devastated crops for farmers in the country. As water levels continue to retreat, who knows what else could be hiding under the surface. 6. Japanese mega submarine. In August of 2013, scientists discovered a Japanese submarine from World War II off the Hawaiian coast. The vessel was 400 feet long and was classified as a Sentoku-type sub. It was one of the largest pre-nuclear submarines ever constructed, and it had been missing since 1946. Scientists from the University of Hawaii made the initial discovery, and they identified the vessel as the I-400. During its time in service, it was said that the sub could travel around the world 1.5 times before it had to stop and refuel, and it was also capable of carrying up to 3 folding-wing bombers that could be launched from its deck just minutes after resurfacing. The submarine was found at a depth of 2,300 feet below the North Pacific Ocean, solving the mystery of the vessel's final fate. Apparently, the United States Navy had captured 5 of the Japanese Imperial Navy subs, the I-400 being one of them toward the end of the Second World War. They then brought the vessels to Pearl Harbor in order to inspect them, but the I-400 was badly torpedoed and it partially collapsed in on itself before sinking into the water at a steep angle. According to Jim Delgado, an archaeologist for the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, NOAA, the US intentionally sank the I-400, but claimed that they didn't have any information on its precise location. This was a way for them to keep the Japanese technology out of the Soviet Union's hands, who demanded that the submarine be returned after they were initially captured. 5. Top secret message. A carrier pigeon from World War II was discovered in a chimney in Surrey, England in 2012, and surprisingly, it still had a coded message tied to its leg. The pigeon was found by Anne and David Martin while they were tearing out their fireplace. As they were doing this, they found the bones of a bird. The couple almost threw the pigeon away, but then they noticed a red container attached to one of its legs. Inside the container was a small strip of paper with a series of 27 coded messages, all made up of different numbers and letters. Anne and David weren't sure what they'd found, so they sent the letter to the curator of the Pigeons at War exhibition, Colin Hill. Carrier pigeons were utilized extensively throughout the entirety of World War II as a way of transporting secret messages back and forth without being easily intercepted. The postal system couldn't be trusted, and there were a lot of people who didn't have access to a telegram machine. At the time, text messaging and email weren't a thing, so they had to look into alternative methods of sending important letters. The pigeon found in Surrey, England was a shocking discovery to say the least. The little bird had been hiding in the home for over 70 years, and the message tied to its leg was still clearly visible. However, the information was coded, but Colin Hill helped to solve it. When he investigated the message, he came to the conclusion that it was most likely sent to Bomber Command shortly after D-Day by a unit in Normandy. In Cheltenham, Gloucestershire, the government communication headquarters GCHQ also took a look at the coded message, but they couldn't figure out exactly what it said. It wasn't until a team of Canadian researchers from Lakefield Heritage Research studied the code that it was deciphered. They did this by utilizing an artillery codebook from World War I. The researchers were able to figure out that the letter was sent by Sergeant William Stott, a paratrooper who landed in occupied Normandy on a secret reconnaissance mission. Apparently, he was sent there in order to assess the strength of the German military in the area. After landing behind enemy lines, he sent a message via carrier pigeon to HQ Bomber Command requesting more information from them, but the letter never made it to its intended destination. Unfortunately, Stott was killed in action just a few weeks after he sent the message. The difficulty researchers had in coding the letter proves just how sophisticated code-making was during the war. In order to hide messages in case they fell into the wrong hands, intelligence had to come up with more and more complex methods of hiding information. Would you rather find out that your neighbor has a huge collection of Nazi paraphernalia, or discover a large unexploded bomb in your backyard that the government pays you to remove? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below, and while you're at it, hit that subscribe button. 4. Nazi Tank Collector. A home near the German city of Kiel was raided in 2015 after German investigators received a tip regarding stolen Nazi artwork. They entered the residence expecting to find some paintings, but instead, they discovered the owner's underground garage filled with all sorts of World War II era weapons. Hidden below this man's house was a personal military museum of sorts, which contained a torpedo, anti-aircraft guns, mortars, over 1,500 rounds of ammunition, and the craziest of all, a German Panther tank. But who was this eccentric war memorabilia collector? And how did he come to be in possession of a weapon capable of mass destruction? Well, it turned out that the home belonged to Klaus Dieter Flick, a man who actively sought out wartime artifacts. He supposedly transported the tank to his hometown of Heikendorf from the Netherlands when a British arms collector reached out to him in 1977. The arms collector found the Panther tank in Surrey while it was being prepared to be sent to the scrapyard. but he thought that Klaus may be able to restore the machine, so he gave him a call, subsequently saving the tank from destruction. A few years later, in 1980, Klaus started the process of restoring the tank. However, this was no easy task as the machine was in very bad condition. The man undertaking the project was once interviewed by the German radio station NDR1 Welle Nord, but he kept his identity a secret. He described the state of the tank in the interview, stating that the sides of the military vehicle were completely cut out and the barrel of the gun was also sliced off. He explained that he had to use other pieces of a Panther tank he had acquired in order to fully repair it. According to a local newspaper during this time, Klaus's entire restoration project had to cost upwards of 500,000 German marks, which would be around $268,575 today. This is not accounting for inflation. In this article, they also claim that the tank's engine was repaired by the Federal Republic of Germany, or the Bundeswehr, for a total of 28,000 euros, $29,407. You would think that Klaus would try to keep this project a secret, but apparently everyone in his neighborhood was aware of what he was doing in his underground garage. Several residents that lived nearby Klaus reported his actions to law enforcement as well as the media, but nobody ever came to stop him or to confiscate the military vehicle. During the snow catastrophe in Germany during the winter of 1978, Klaus was seen by multiple people driving the tank around. These accounts were confirmed by the mayor of Heikendorf, Alexander Orth, in an article that was published in the German daily newspaper called Süddeutsche Zeitung. Klaus kept this tank in his garage for nearly 40 years before he ever faced any consequences. But after his weapons cache was discovered by investigators, the German military was sent in to remove every piece of his collection, including the Panther tank. It took 20 men, a total of 9 hours, to fully remove the tank from the home. As a result of his not-so-secret illegal hobby, Klaus was fined 558,551 German marks, $300,000. He was forced to pay an additional 61,434 marks for lying about the Bundeswehr helping him restore the tank's engine. In addition, he was also ordered to serve a 14-month suspended prison sentence. 3. Fatty fines. In 2012, a storm raged across Scotland over the holiday months, and as a result, several unusual World War II-era relics washed up on the country's frigid coast. About 100 miles from North Edinburgh at St. Cyrus Natural Reserve, 4 giant chunks of lard washed up on the beach. The lard was no longer contained within their original barrels, but the tallow was still virtually intact. According to local officials, the pig fat was still formed into a barrel shape, and it was still a bright white color beneath the layers of barnacles that had grown on its exterior. But where did this lard come from? This was a question that many locals were likely wondering at the time, and the answer came from the manager of St. Cyrus Natural Reserve, Therese Alampo. She released a statement to the Scottish Natural Heritage (SNH), explaining that the storm had broken apart a shipwreck that was buried on the beach, unleashing the tallow from within it. Apparently, this wasn't the first time lard has washed up on the beaches of Scotland. This first happened during World War II, when a merchant ship was bombed, unleashing barrels of fat into the sea, subsequently ending up on the country's coast. Angus McCarty, a local resident, told SNH that the barrels first started appearing along the shore in 1940, and they've continued to do so every couple of decades when a bad storm hits the area. 2. The Lost Battlefield. Ottawa is the site where a World War II-era battlefield was discovered in Papua New Guinea in 2010. It's located to the west of the Eora Creek village at an elevation of approximately 6,502 feet. The site has since been given the nicknames the Lost Battlefield and the Japanese Forest Fort. After the Japanese started to withdraw from the area northward, this place was fully reinforced with defenses against the ever-advancing Australians. On a ridge overlooking the land below, Ottawa was established as a strong defensive position, equipped with rifle pits and machine guns. Starting on October 22, 1942, the Battle of Eora Creek began, and it lasted a total of 7 days. In the end, the Japanese were forced to flee as they were outnumbered and outsmarted by the Australian military. For many years following the battle, people in the area avoided this place out of respect for the spirits who lost their lives in combat. and they've also protected the battlefield from disturbances as well as from outsiders. However, on April 23, 2010, Ryan Freeman, a former military man, rediscovered Itoa. While investigating the site, he found the remains of 3 forgotten Japanese soldiers, several helmets, plenty of ammunition, and weapons including unexploded bombs. Today, Itoa is managed by NMAG, the National Museum of Art Gallery, and is under the protection of the Kokoda Military Heritage Management Plan, KMHMP, since it's within the Kokoda Interim Protection Zone. They funded 2 archaeological projects here in 2011 and 2012, and since then, all of the human remains have been recovered. The area is currently off limits to the general public, but NMAG has plans to open it to visitors sometime in the near future. 1. Hitler's cartoons. In 2008, a man from northern Norway named William Huckvug purchased some old drawings from a German auction, which he claims were done by Adolf Hitler himself. Among the sketches, he found colorful cartoons depicting Snow White and the 7 Dwarfs characters Dog and Bashful from the 1937 Disney film, each of which was signed A.H. or A. Hitler. He also discovered an unsigned drawing of Pinocchio, just as he appeared in the movie from 1940. You may be wondering, why would Hitler draw Disney cartoon characters? Well, the answer is quite simple. Before he turned into the harsh and deplorable dictator we all know from history class, he actually tried to make a living as an artist. Hitler also apparently owned 2 copies of Snow White, and it's been reported that he frequently watched the film in his private cinema. However, there hasn't been any confirmation as to whether these were real, authentic sketches done by the Nazi leader. Huckvug claimed to have performed numerous tests on the drawings, and he found that they dated back to 1940, but there's no way to truly confirm whether they were completed by Hitler or not. However, these signatures on the sketches seem to match up with some of the dictator's other paintings and artwork, so unless confirmed otherwise, Hitler may have been an avid fan of Disney and even drew some of the beloved characters from their films from time to time. Which of these discoveries from World War II did you find the most fascinating? Let us know in the comments below, and don't forget to subscribe to the channel. Thanks so much for watching, and we'll see you next time. Bye!